At Making Medicine, we're reporting on the headlines, not making medical recommendations. For personal health questions, always consult a doctor. Nothing in this episode constitutes investment, financial, or legal advice, and please consult your own advisors before making decisions. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Medicine podcast, where science, policy, and innovation meet. As always, I'm your host, John Stanford. Today, we have founder and CEO of Seaport Therapeutics, Daphne Zohar, joining us to share her take on what's happening in the biotech ecosystem. Prior to Seaport, she of course founded PureTech Health, where she helped co-found companies like Therapeutics. Her leadership drove a pipeline of nearly 30 new medicines and had a clinical success rate 6 times the industry average. Clearly, she's doing something right. That's why she's been recognized by about every outlet imaginable as a leader in the biotech space. She sits on the executive committee for Bio and co-hosts her own biotech industry podcast, the Biotech Hangout, which I'm sure many of you have been on. It's lots to cover, and it's a great episode, so let's get into the show. Daphne, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, before we dive into all the things that you are seeing in the ecosystem, one of the most often questions we get from listeners is, how did so-and-so get there? How do you get to the top of status list, which of course you're at? And so I'm curious, even before Seaport and PureTech, what was your path to get into biotech? Why are you where you are today?
So the idea that I had in starting PureTech was to create almost like an institutional version of an entrepreneur. So just like a VC is an institutional version of an angel investor, you could think of it that way. So that was the idea of having a process, a rigorous process where different people are doing different things in order to start a company, create a new program. And that was actually the first of the hub and spoke model biotechs. So we were kind of a hybrid between venture creation and biotech, biopharma. And we were the first. Now there's a number of these types of entities that are, for example, like BridgeBio, Roivant, Centessa, and many others. And I think the advantage of the hub and spoke model is that you have one hub, a group of individuals that can move their time and resources between different programs. So it's been a very successful model from an R&D perspective, but a little bit less so from an investor perspective because it's less well understood by investors.
In part of your incredible bio, telling people who's going to be on the show, one of the things we highlighted is your clinical success outcomes. You're not 1 or 2 standard deviations away. You are 6x what would be expected. Do you attribute that to this hub and spoke mentality, or is that something different?
I think it's a little bit of that because there's a rigor. And by the way, that doesn't have to be limited to hub and spoke. At Seaport, we have the same approach, which is that you are aligned with, everybody. All the stakeholders are aligned that if something is not working well, you shut it down if you need to. So, and you can do that if you have, for example, a platform and multiple programs like we have at Seaport. But I think the second part of what was driving the success in the clinic is this idea that there's often failure when you go from preclinical to clinical proof of concept. And one of the things that we did well at PureTech and now at Seaport is we started with signals of human efficacy. In the case of Seaport, we're identifying new medicines that had previously shown clinical validation, but were held back by an issue that we can now solve with our Glyph platform. So we don't have the same translational risk in terms of human proof of concept. There's other risks, of course, but we take that out of the equation, and that helps to improve the clinical success rate. There's also, I think, a factor of experience and execution, design and execution of the studies. And, I think that's a big part of what we're doing at Seaport as well.
Well, I know you're saying that there's a little lag still in the investment community around understanding, but de-risking is certainly something they will understand. It's certainly I love that sort of concept of human signals as early on as possible, because that is where the science takes a detour. For folks not familiar, so obviously, PureTech, enormous success, particularly with Karuna, and then Seaport. What problem do you feel like you're trying to solve? Because from a successful entrepreneur standpoint, building PureTech could have been enough. It's been enormously successful and impactful. What did you see about Seaport that makes it feel like it's kept you hungry to take the leadership home there?
Right. So at PureTech, we were applying this model, this hub and spoke model. At Seaport, we don't have the hub and spoke model, but we're basically a traditional biotech with a platform technology and multiple programs. The most advanced is in a phase 2b study. So in terms of the problem that we're trying to solve at Seaport and why I wanted to join Seaport, take a step back and go back to the founding of Karuna, which I did together with colleagues at PureTech and Steve Paul, who's my co-founder, one of my co-founders at Seaport. We had very similar strategy in many ways at Karuna. So the idea was to start with a molecule that had previously shown efficacy. In that case, it was xanomeline in the hands of Eli Lilly, but it had issues. It had GI-related AEs, which caused it to not be developed. At PureTech, we came up with this idea of what's now called Cobenfy or KarXT to couple xanomeline with a muscarinic receptor antagonist that doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, and that therefore the idea is that you wouldn't have the side effects in the periphery, but you'd get the efficacy in the brain. So that was an idea, but at Seaport, we have a very similar strategy where we're taking drugs that previously shown efficacy, but we have here something I think we didn't have at Karuna, which is the Glyph platform. And that actually is uniquely positioned to solve some of the issues that have held back potentially really important neuropsychiatric medicines. So the Glyph platform, what it does is it traffics drugs through the lymphatic system. And what that enables is the avoidance of first pass metabolism. So you can take drugs that had previously only been administered via IV and administer them orally. You can address side effects like liver-related AEs and other side effects. And you also create novel composition of matter IP anytime you glyph a molecule, which is something we didn't have at Karuna. Actually, we had 100 investors that passed on Karuna, and the biggest reason was that there wasn't composition of matter IP. So those are some differences, some similarities. And you ask what the issue is, like what are we trying to solve? What we're trying to do is address two of the biggest areas of unmet need in chronic conditions, which are depression and anxiety. And these are really among the most disabling of all neuropsychiatric conditions. There's hundreds of millions of people affected. The drugs that we have issues. They have modest efficacy. A third of patients don't respond. They take weeks to work. But even with that, if you look at the drugs that were approved for depression, many of them, if not all of them, have been successful commercially, successful in terms of reaching patients because the needs are so great. Now, coming back to myself, what made me want to do this? Well, we had developed the Glyph platform at PureTech. So we had actually licensed that in from Monash University. We were working on it for about 5 years. And I saw that it was working. So we were applying, we had a number of different technology platforms that we were advancing, and this one kept working. And so that was one piece of it. We were applying it to different molecules, moving them forward. And then the second piece of it was that I have family members who are affected by depression and anxiety. I have a 16-year-old with depression. My mother has anxiety. So I'm very motivated to find ways to help, and not just my family, but I think there's hardly any families that aren't affected by depression and anxiety. So the idea that you could actually make an impact broadly, and we know these drugs, there's some really great drugs that work, but haven't been advanced. And so that was really the thinking behind it. And then the third piece of it was working with colleagues that I'd worked with before, like Steve Paul and then Bob Nelson at Arch, who was our first investor at Karuna. So that was also a big draw.
Well, I think that the personal connection is something that comes through on probably every conversation we have with a CEO or a founder is the personal opportunity for impact. And so, I think we're all glad that you're you're staying in after so much success that, it'll be great to see what Seaport brings next. But Seaport's not even enough. You're also on the exec board at Bio, and you do Biotech Hangout. Curious, what drove you to advocacy, and what drove you to start Biotech Hangout, and how has that ability to communicate with so many people played a role in your work?
Yeah, so in terms of advocacy, I've been involved with Bio, and it's a great organization. I'm also involved with No Patient Left Behind,
Mm-hmm.
which is a group you know well. And I think that the idea of having the small biotech voice as part of these general policy discussions is very important because there's misperceptions. People don't know that we're scrappy entrepreneurs. It's very hard to raise money for the translation of academic innovation, what's called the Valley of Death. And there's a tremendous need to think about policies that help to feed the ecosystem so that we have the ability to raise money and develop new medicines. So we can come back to some of the policy stuff.
Yeah.
In terms of Biotech Hangout, it was the pandemic, and it was right after JP Morgan. I think there was this thing called Clubhouse, which came into, was very popular, and now is out. But Chris Garabedian, Brad Carr got on right after JP Morgan, and it was like a virtual JP Morgan. They started talking, hundreds of people joined. And that was the start of Biotech Hangout. I joined, I think it was like the second or third week. I joined the audience. Chris saw me, brought me up. And then after that, I became kind of a regular co-host. And after a while, we decided to move it to Biotech, to Spaces, to Twitter, but
Mm-hmm.
we stream on podcasts and Spotify. And I think really what's unique about Hangout is it's a community of people. We, kind of put together a list of the top 10 stories. We send an email around. There's no scripting really. It's completely live. Each week we have different co-hosts, and it's almost like the water cooler discussion. And we've got analysts, investors, CEOs. So it's what the insiders are saying about the latest news. And I think it's somewhat unique. We do invite journalists on a lot. We're not trying to compete with journalists. It's just like a different venue.
I mean, it's such you put on like your high school history hat. It's a primary source. And that's one of the things I like. I love endpoints. I love stat, and it's great. But as a listener, if I want to know what's really happening in the biotech space, that's all I kind of have to go to hear it straight from the people who are living it, not the reporting on the people who are living it. So I just think it's been incredibly helpful to us doing our work, because if you think about what Incubate's trying to do, we're trying to translate that for policymakers and address some of those misconceptions. And so it's been great. I ended up downloading Clubhouse and was like, I don't know what this app is, but I know there's one conversation I want to hear on it. And so it's been a huge success. So congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. And I have to say it's a community. So, we have analysts like Josh Schimmer and Jeroen Werber and, Paul Matisse. And I'm not going to even name all the analysts, investors, and others. And I actually have gotten busy. And so I'm on every like 3 or 4 weeks, but it just kind of runs itself. And I should say Shannon and Daniela on my team pretty much they do all the heavy lifting. So
there's always a great team behind everyone, and at Making Medicine, we certainly have that as well. I want to pivot a little bit to the ecosystem. I guess one last question about you and your companies. We've had a lot of conversation about Massachusetts, had a lot of conversations about clusters. I was just in Japan for a week where they're trying to build these clusters. Could Seaport be Seaport? Could PureTech be PureTech outside of Boston?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a community here that is really unique, and it's a community that builds on the academic institutions here in Boston, the research and teaching hospitals where there's a lot of innovation, and then you have major pharmaceutical companies here. So there's that piece of it. There's CEOs and entrepreneurs that have already done this sort of translational work and brought drugs and brought new medicines forward to patients. raised capital, brought capital returns back to their shareholders. So there's this whole ecosystem. And I think that I've seen places like, for example, in the UK, where you've got really great science and you've got pieces of the ecosystem, but there you have an issue with the investment
Mm-hmm.
landscape for the later stage companies. And so what ends up happening in places like that is you get a lot of great innovation, and then the companies, once they get to a certain stage, they end up moving to the US, whether it be the NASDAQ or kind of physically moving to the US. So that's, I think you need the whole ecosystem. It is possible to recreate that ecosystem. I don't know if we would be the same company. I know I wouldn't have been able to build my network in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I started PureTech, I didn't know anybody in this industry. And it was like you meet one person, you meet another person, and you just kind of build your network over years. But it's easier to do when you're seeing people in person.
Well, that should be a great reminder of everyone starts somewhere. And so we definitely have a set of entrepreneurs early stage, maybe even commercializing professors or things like that. There was a point when Daphne didn't know anybody and was going out building a network around Kendall Square at coffee shops. So that's a bright spot for people to remember.
Oh, I mean, I can tell you, raising our first $100,000 was so much harder than raising like 325 million at Seaport. I mean, it was so hard. And I think that people can get discouraged, and there is a tendency, there's kind of a virtuous cycle. Once you've shown that you can
Mm-hmm.
do it, then everybody wants to invest and back you. But up until that time, it's really hard. So it's something that you can either apprentice, like you can join a venture firm or you can join a company, you can learn from people and kind of build your network that way, or you can prove yourself, and that's harder. It takes many years, but it's yeah, it's a hard industry to break into.
Well, on that concept of the link between capital and proven people and exits, I saw you had posted recently on the Metsera news. I really liked your take on this. That besides the drama between the acquiring companies, that the acquisition was a particular success for the people who invested in it because it would recycle the funds that were in there, and it gives a much needed sort of liquidity moment to some really key partners that we've profiled. Walk us through that. Why is it so important, not for Pfizer and Metsera, but what this means for biotechs who are out there looking for capital?
Right. So we talked a little bit about this kind of valley of death. And the idea is that there's a lot of innovations that don't make it across this valley of death. And the valley of death is the space between academic innovation and the point of time where investors are actively supporting programs. And that's usually post some kind of proof of concept.
Mm-hmm.
So the what ends up happening is investors back entrepreneurs that are developing new medicines, usually after they've proven or they've answered key questions. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation in terms of the earlier stage of drug development. People say, oh, come back to us after you've done the following three experiments. A lot of, for example, pharma companies will say that they'll be right there. They'll know that there's some exciting work happening, and they'll say, get back to us when you've done those
Mm-hmm.
experiments. Or there's a lot of VCs that will say, we're only backing things post proof of concept. So what happens when you get M&A transactions that pay off the ecosystem that backed these many early ideas is that they can then reinvest, redeploy. And the list of investors that I shared there were investors like Arch, for example, one of our investors, great, very innovative. They've done a lot for early stage innovation, but also later stage investors like Fidelity. And when they do really well and own 14% or close to 15% of a company that is sold for $9 billion, the next generation of companies that are trying to do their next clinical proof of concept, they have multiple investors that are interested in backing it because they want to back the next Metsera or the next Blueprint or the next, there's many different companies that have had successful exits this year.
Hmm.
Feels like it's opening up. IPOs still haven't happened. So, there's a few. The IPO market's not fully open, but you do see M&A transactions, follow-ons are healthy. So, there are positive signals.
And I think those positive signals are critically important because of some of the policy uncertainty, gloom, frankly, bad policy over the last few years, as we would see as it relates to price controls. You mentioned China, so let's stay there for a moment. How do you, successful biotech executive, you're as central to this ecosystem as anyone. How do you see China intersecting with this industry?
I think there's learnings, right? So we can learn and we should learn and we should emulate the things that they're doing well. And that has to do with the speed to get into the clinic, speed to run clinical studies, and many resources that the government in China has invested in those capabilities. And I hear, for example, McCary and others talking about emulating that here in the US. So I hear positive signals. I don't know how quickly we'll be able to translate those. But I know that, for example, we will do early phase 1 studies, early proof of concept studies, often in Australia because it's quicker. And then we'll file an IND later. So, there's definitely learnings from places like Australia, like China. I think there's a whole other piece of China which is very concerning, and that has to do with you could say, to be charitable, you could say, Me Too, fast follower.
Mm-hmm.
And if you wanted to be a little bit more aggressive, you could say IP theft, right? So what happens when a company that is innovating goes and publishes in Nature or Science, files a patent, and then that there's a group of companies in China that can quickly take what you just published and move ahead of you. And then I think the other piece of it is what happens when large pharmaceutical companies start doing big deals with those companies. And that's when you start getting concerned. So what could we do from a policy perspective? I think there's two pieces of it. The carrot, where whenever I bring up the carrot, everybody's supportive. When I bring up the stick, there's a little bit less support. So I'll bring up both. And I'd be fine with just the carrot. But how do you make it more attractive for large pharmaceutical companies to do deals with US biotechs? And I think there's a number of things you could do, like tax incentives. I've tried to advocate for making net operating losses, NOLs, survive major dilutive financings and M&A transactions. Because if a big pharma company could access your NOLs and you have 300 million of costs, or whatever it is by the time the big pharma company is buying the smaller biotech, that's obviously going to make the acquisition more attractive, similar to what you see with the vouchers, right? So the pediatric vouchers and the rare disease vouchers, which are transferred and they actually have value. So I think that there's a number of things from a policy perspective that we could do, and those could be tied to innovator status, U.S. domiciled companies that have been advancing innovations from the U.S. and things like that. The other thing that you could think about is the stick approaches, and that is to tie regulatory status, reimbursement, even FTC-related M&A decisions to, being the innovator and not having any IP theft involved. So that's more complicated. It's more controversial.
All ideas come with controversy. I want to go back to I'm going to say back to the NOL idea. We've had some folks come on, some sort of China experts, and we talk about they're selling similar innovation for 60, 70 cents on the dollar. One of the concepts could be level setting that to US biotech would be allowing the NOL. And that's how you could close the gap between a cheaper asset out of China that frankly was built on the back of innovation maybe somewhere else. And the US biotechs would have these recognizable losses that frankly could get closer to evening out. Am I saying that right?
Exactly. So if you're looking at two different companies, one's in China, one's in the US, and the US company has invested a lot in R&D. And that is then, you could see that in the NOLs. And then you can actually access those NOLs and use them, to offset profits because you're a large company and you're making profits. The smaller companies actually can't benefit from the NOLs often. So it would be a really nice way to reinforce the ecosystem, the M&A, the recirculation of capital, people, and other resources back to the early stage so that new medicines can get developed.
Well, it is certainly timely. We don't have a meeting with a policymaker where China doesn't come up. And I think we are beginning to see, depending on where you are in the value chain, even just amongst investors. We have some in the investor community that have been making relationships and plans in China, and some folks who have stayed far away. And now that's leading to divergent views around the next step. But I think what's critically clear is this is a conversation we have to be having, and kicking around these ideas, controversial or not.
For sure. Glad that you're doing that, by the way. It's really important.
Yeah, I think it's critically important. It comes up as often as the other topic I want to get your thoughts on, of price controls broadly, because we have, of course, under President Biden, we found ourselves stuck with the IRA, the pill penalty, orphan cures, which has sort of been since addressed in one big beautiful bill. Instead of going into the weeds of MFN specifically, the concept of a price control, as someone who has created a company, led to actual medicine creation, if we say, hey, X, Y, and Z therapeutic is likely to be price controlled, walk us through from your executive position, if price controls existed tomorrow like they do in the EU, how could that change things at Seaport?
Right. Well, I would say, first of all, it would change things for patients because in the EU, they don't have access to the same medicines that we have. And I think that's going to get even worse with some of the MFN policy. So companies are going to make choices about whether it's worth it to launch in the EU. In the past, and I completely agree with the concept behind MFN, right? The idea that we want to fix this imbalance, the free riding system of rest of the world over the US. 100% agree with that approach. The question is how you do it. And if you slap a price control, what you're doing is you're limiting the upside. And so coming back to this valley of death, right? 1 out of 100 medicines make it. And it's even like 1 out of 200 if you go back to like patented innovations. If you go all the way back, like things that just are ideas that get patented versus those that actually get spun out or into companies or licensed out. Think about 1% or less make it all the way. So if you're an investor, and it takes 10 to 15 years or more to take that new medicine from academia all the way to patients. If you're an investor, there's all this risk involved. And the only reason why you're taking on the risk is because you know that every once in a while, you're going to have a payout that's going to be, $5-10 billion payout, which then recycles the cash back. It pays off all the ones that didn't succeed because there are going to be a number of these that investors back that get shut down. So if you cap the upside, what's going to happen is investors are going to just move their money to other things. Already, if you look at the XBI over the last 5 years versus the S&P 500, XBI has underperformed, right? So it's true that right now we're in a situation where it's looking like XBI and biotechs are really kind of on a roll and about to be, I would say, almost like a safe haven or outperforming.
Yeah.
That's what it's looking like. We'll see. But if you do things that make it less attractive, investors will just take their money elsewhere. Entrepreneurs will choose different things to do because what we do is really hard. It's really risky. And as an executive, you asked me like what it's like. I've been a leader of a company where we're turning the card. Basically, we're finding out whether the results of a clinical study went well, whether it met the primary endpoint and was a success or not. And it is a roller coaster for everyone involved, for the entire team, for patients, for leadership, for the investors. And often it doesn't go the way people would hope. So, at least you know that on the other side, if you did well and you did all this stuff for years and years and you made it, then there's a payoff. So I think it's any form of price control is damaging. What we can do, though, is look at the middlemen. And think about ways that, there's a whole number of things that we could do. I think the problem is I sort of feel like there's an impasse where the biotech pharma industry doesn't necessarily want to negotiate yet. So like we'll see, but they're waiting to see if they can push back on it. And at some point, people will start talking about what's the best way to do it. If you're going to try to address this issue, what's the best way to do it? If it were up to me, I would have done it sooner, but I'm not a lawyer at a big pharma company. So, they have all of their considerations.
You keep a very busy schedule. You'll probably kick off the year at JP Morgan. Anything on your radar? Any events that our listeners who are anxiously signing up and RSVPing to, anything on your radar that they should look out for?
Yeah, actually, I'll mention two things. One is that on Tuesday at 7 p.m. at Persona, we're doing what we call our Tweet Up, or basically it's a Biotech Hangout live event. So people can come, they can meet the co-hosts. We get a great turnout each year, and we have sponsors that support free drinks for all. So that's a great event, and I hope to see you there. And then also Tuesday at 4 p.m., the Biotech CEO Sisterhood is doing a group photo. And we've asked again this year for people to wear pink, just a little pink. You can wear like a pink tie, you can wear a pink shirt, pink socks. And the idea is that last year on Tuesday, instead of having a sea of black suits, we actually saw, a lot of pink. And that is to recognize the leadership of women in our industry, who have done really great work over the last few years, including kind of leading on the M&A side. So those are the two things that are on my radar, and of course your event.
Yeah, and Grace would absolutely kill me if I didn't mention Incubate's policy breakfast Monday morning before we let the serious deal making commence. I will say on the Sisterhood front, it was a sea of pink last year out in the square right in front of the St. Francis. So everyone remember to wear pink on Tuesday. You would absolutely be foolish to miss out on the Tweet Up. So thanks for sharing that, and we'll look forward to seeing you at JP Morgan. Keeping an eye towards 2026, FDA has soap opera-esque dramas aside, has the FDA continued to function, in your view, in a satisfactory way? And if it doesn't, if it stops, what does that uncertainty at regulatory agencies mean for you?
Yeah, so I think that there's sort of the global uncertainty, and how that affects the stock markets, investor sentiment, and things like that, which affects the early stage companies. And all kinds of uncertainty, but I think the most damaging kind of uncertainty is when FDA gives guidance and then changes the guidance later, because that could be tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars spent by a company in the belief that on the other side they have alignment. And that has to do with, we've seen a few examples like that. Replimune is one, for example. And
Yeah.
Those are very, I think, very concerning. In terms of functioning of FDA, it's mixed. I mean, we've had a very productive and active and responsive dialogue with FDA. But I've heard, and actually No Patient Left Behind just did a survey that they're going to be, I think, posting very soon, where there are mixed signals about different parts of FDA and how they're functioning. There is a loss of talent in some areas. But, I think people are happy with McCary. They're happy with Richard Pazdur. And I was skeptical about Prasad, but I got a chance to meet him and McCary at one of these listening sessions. And, I'm hopeful that that group can do good things. Obviously, there's a lot of things like vaccine misinformation and stuff like that that is concerning. So from a smaller kind of earlier stage company to a mid-stage company like ours, we're in kind of mid-stage clinical studies. I think it's something to watch, but it's not, I think hopefully there'll be continuity through administrations, just given how long it takes to develop new drugs and less politics.
What's something that you're excited for?
Well, I think M&A this year has been the strongest since 2019, so that's very positive that you see money flowing back into the sector, hearing from bankers and analysts that the sentiment in biotech is turning to risk on. Valuations have recovered for clinical stage companies, not yet for preclinical. And I think that this recent appointment at Cedar has comforted some people. Most interesting is that in the past, we talked about M&A. Smaller biotechs were not successful at launching drugs commercially, but we're seeing that change. So that actually, I think, is really important for the continuity of our industry. But, I'm feeling pretty positive about biotech and, obviously very excited and positive about neuropsychiatry and what we're potentially able to do at Seaport.
Well, we're very grateful that you took time to be with us. Hopefully, we'll be able to have you back on in 2026 to see all the progress that I'm sure you and Seaport will have made. And hopefully, certainty and no politics can be the watchword for next year. Daphne, so glad you could join us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for all the work that you're doing.
That's all for this week's episode of the Making Medicine podcast. Thank you again to Daphne Zohar for joining us today. Have a thought or question about today's topics? Drop a comment. We'll feature it in next week's episode. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and follow us on LinkedIn, X, and Instagram using the links in the description. Thanks for listening, and as always, keep innovating.